Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Season 8 is all about the re-enchanting Inklings. How do we rebuild, renew, and restore culture? The Inklings give us a model. I want to ask for your help in two ways. You're probably watching this episode on X or on YouTube. Please find and follow us on both platforms. I tweet as at the Optimistic C3. And then if you're looking for the show on YouTube, just search for the Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want you to be able to find and follow our content and then be able to share that across your platforms. We want to be part of the conversation and help other people to see how life is truly good, true, and beautiful. And now, on to this week's episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. Sarah Waters, lecturer in English literature at the University of Buckingham in the UK. I met Sarah at the Undiscovered Lewis Conference just a few months ago, where she was presenting on her specialty, the relationship between C.S. Lewis and William Shakespeare. Today, I'm delighted to bring her on the show. Sarah, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, before we get into Lewis and Shakespeare, tell us a bit of your story. How did you get into studying Lewis? What caused the Shakespeare connection to really rise to your attention?
So I came to Lewis in a somewhat unconventional manner, perhaps. I had the Narnia books read to me when I was younger, although we didn't actually have all of the Narnia books, and the selection we had were quite a strange selection. So I had read The Last Battle long before I had read earlier texts in the series, for example. But I became really interested as an undergraduate in the kind of afterlives of Shakespeare. What we do with him now, basically, how we adapt him, how we appropriate him. I got excited by things like 10 Things I Hate About You, which is an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew, and I thought that was a really cool concept of taking ideas from Shakespeare's plays, but then repackaging them, sometimes as a kind of neat and tidy adaptation, but often more in terms of what does it mean to say, use Lady Macbeth as a sign to indicate that you should wash your hands, which some universities have done. And I kind of got interested in that. I knew that there had been some work done looking at how Tolkien was using Shakespeare in his writing. And so essentially on a whim, which is what you should never do when you're doing research, of course, I thought, well, Tolkien and Lewis were kind of working on things. I knew Lewis was an academic. I didn't know a huge amount about his academic side of things, except his work on Milton, because we had looked at that when we were studying Paradise Lost. And so I, on a hunch, pitched a project on Shakespeare and the Chronicles of Narnia for my master's thesis. Luckily for me, when I read them over or reread them over Christmas and read some for the first time, there were some Shakespeare connections. So I had a project and it was good to go. And as I started working on that, I started to find more and more connections.
Well, take us through just a little bit of what you found in Narnia. I'm pretty familiar with the Chronicles of Narnia, but I don't have anything that immediately leaps to mind as like, oh, there it is. Of course, that is King Lear, or that's Julius Caesar showing up in Shakespeare, or showing up in Narnia.
Yeah, and I don't ever make the case that I think there's some kind of Shakespeare code or anything like that. I think Shakespeare is one of many, many things that Lewis is drawing on in Narnia. There are some perhaps more straightforward connections, which lots of people have kind of drawn out. But perhaps the most straightforward one to use as an example would be the way he uses Hamlet. I recently published an article where I go into more detail about this, but essentially, you can go with the kind of usurping uncle on the throne. That's Prince Caspian, right? And the prince who has to avenge his father. His father is disposed of in unfortunate circumstances. So that's a kind of straightforward thing. Now, Lewis is not necessarily only using Shakespeare's Hamlet in that case, but in The Silver Chair, he makes a direct reference to Hamlet, and when they're discovering the prince underground, and they don't know it's Prince Rilian yet, he is described as being dressed all in black and looking altogether a little bit like Hamlet. Now, your average child reader is not necessarily going to know Hamlet at that stage, right? They're probably going to encounter Narnia before they encounter Hamlet. But what's kind of cool is to think about the fact that when they later hear about Hamlet, they're going to make this interesting connection, which is like, oh, kind of like Rilian. And Lewis, I argue at least, unpacks ideas about deception and disguise, and kind of more than just that one word reference to Hamlet.
That's really interesting. Lewis does that in so many different places. I think I spent a decent amount of time this afternoon over at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I've got a research project cooking about looking at Lewis's edition of the Fairy Queen and the annotations
Oh,
in there.
great. Yeah.
And it was just shocking. I now have 4 pages of notes of all the references that Lewis makes to different things in
Yeah.
as he's commenting on different sections, and that's just what he does. And it's really cool to see that happening in the Cost of Narnia. Um, well, before we get into more of the Lewis and Shakespeare connection, tell us a little bit more about your university, and if I read your CV correctly, you were a student there, and now you're a professor there. How is that dynamic? Is it the same place that you studied at? Is it different being on the other side of the lectern? How is that?
Yes, that's right. So I did my undergraduate and master's here. My undergraduate was English literature with French, and then my master's was English literature by research. And then I went to Oxford Brookes University to do my PhD. So I was away for a while. I haven't stayed my entire career here. And then I came back in sort of early 2020, 2021, and started working for the department, the English department, where I did my undergraduate. In lots of ways, it's kind of interesting and cool because our university is pretty unusual in that we do our degrees in 2 years rather than the traditional 3 or 4. And so when my students complain that I don't know what it's like, I can say, yes, I know exactly what it's like. I did it myself and I'm sorry. And it's worth it and it's great, but it is a lot of work. Um, and so, in lots of ways, the university has kind of developed since I've been here. We've got a medical school now. That was sort of in the early stages when I was an undergraduate, and our offering of different subjects has really diversified, really over the last sort of 10 years or so. But the English department has changed in some ways in terms of working with different staff, but actually some of my colleagues taught me as an undergraduate. So, for example, I share an office with the person who did those Shakespeare lectures I was referring to earlier, who inspired me to go on and do my masters and supervise my masters. So in that way, that's kind of cool and pretty unique as well.
Those kinds of connections are absolutely priceless. Well, let's get into Lewis. I wanted to ask you: Does Lewis tend to gravitate towards Shakespeare's plays or his sonnets, or and in which writings does this tend to show up more often than others? I was thinking through when I go to Paralandra, it's very easy to see Milton kind of behind almost every scene. Charles Williams is kind of famously the strongest influence in that hideous strength. Is there any one place you're like, oh, of course, Shakespeare is just permeating this particular work from Lewis?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think so in quite the same way because I don't think Shakespeare had so much of a kind of imaginative impact on Lewis as much as someone like Milton did. I It would be somewhat unfair to topple Milton or Spencer from that position, I think. I don't think Shakespeare's quite going to cut it. Um, but that's not to say that I don't think he was a significant influence in terms of the way that Lewis structured certain things. So I mentioned Hamlet earlier. Hamlet's the play that he references most frequently across his writings. That's true in his correspondence. It's true in his writing. His perhaps best known work on Shakespeare, so far as his work on Shakespeare is known, is his lecture that he gives to the British Academy, which is on Hamlet. So you can kind of see that sort of tracking through. That's 1942. His most substantial amount of writing on Shakespeare, aside from that, though, is on Shakespeare's poetry. And this has meant people have kind of thought, well, he wasn't so much interested in the plays, he was more interested in the poetry. And in the Oxford History of English Literature, that's where he really gets into, especially the sonnets, but also some of the narrative poems as well. And partly it's that he was mostly thinking about sort of Renaissance verse and so on for the nature of what he was doing for Oxford History of English Literature. But he's interested in the poetic in Shakespeare's plays when he's thinking about the plays, so they sort of overlap, really. But yeah, I think there's probably a reason why he keeps referring to Hamlet and then decides to do his British Academy lecture on Hamlet in terms of the sort of impact that it's had on him. Hamlet's also the thing that he keeps referring to in the Great War as well. When he's writing back and forth with Barfield, he talks about how, well, he's talking about the relationship of people with God, essentially. It's more, it'll be like Hamlet meeting Shakespeare. If he was going to do that, it would have to be Shakespeare's doing. Hamlet couldn't sort of do it himself, right? He comes back to it and surprised by joy. He talks about it in Pilgrim's Regress. I think for him, it's a kind of easy sort of touchstone in that sense.
No, that's really helpful, and certainly I know I may have a few listeners who would be interested in going through Lewis's Oh Hell volume, but probably not many. But I suspect most folks listening to the show have read or watched Kenneth Branagh's version, or hopefully seen staged some version of Hamlet, so they'll be able to see those kinds of touchstones. As I was prepping for today's episode, I found your article in an unexpected journal on Lewis, Lear, and the Four Loves, and you had a line there that if this works, I'll be able to put this on the yes, it did work. I'm going to put that here on the screen here to ask you about. But I thought this was a very interesting way to consider Lewis and Lewis with Shakespeare, because of course Lewis is infamous as an apologetics figure. I mean, that is perhaps what he's most known for, outside of those who actually love stories for their own sake. I mean, my parents knew Lewis or Mere Christianity and Apologetics. They were happy I was reading Narnia, but they didn't really want to read Narnia.
Sure.
But you had this great line, stepping away from the immediate frame of the gospel, or the frame of our immediate time and place, Lewis uses King Lear to nudge his readers towards the realization that to empathize with or be affected by someone in a book, in a play, in our family, in our neighborhood, is to recognize something profoundly fundamental to human flourishing. Walk us through a bit of what you're thinking here in terms of like, what is Lewis doing with using Shakespeare in kind of an unexpected route to apologetics? Because I mean, we know Lewis and Mere Christianity, but you're pointing at something very different in this line.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I think in what he's doing in the Four Lives, he sort of does across his apologetics. Is that he's trying to find a way in for his readers, or in the case of Mere Christianity, of course, for his listeners initially as well. And he writes to James Welch early on when they're asking him to do these BBC radio talks, and he says essentially, well, we could assume in the New Testament times that people would know the Old Testament. We can't even assume that people will know the New Testament at this stage. And he's saying that, almost 100 years ago. And he's trying to find these different avenues through which he can kind of reach people. And I think while that might not necessarily be true today that Shakespeare would work like that, in Lewis's period, Shakespeare does work like that. He's someone that everyone is studying, maybe not necessarily going to watch the plays of, but certainly reading the plays, whether that's at school or beyond that. And so for him, Shakespeare becomes a kind of reference point. Well, it would be, like we make a reference to a TV show that we can assume everyone will know, for example, today. When I do that, I sound dated to my students, I'm sure, but that's partly because I don't have a TV. But the idea, the same kind of idea of, well, you all know this concept, right? So that idea that you're familiar with is like this thing that you're less familiar with, but is really exciting and is a message that you need to hear. And so he assumes that people will have a basic concept of the plot of King Lear, for example. And so they'll know that story. And he gives them the basic premise of the story, even if they don't really know it. And then says, well, this concept about love that you don't know and that you need to think about, here's what it looks like when it's gone bad, and here's the here's the lesson from that, basically.
Just so it's genius in one way. I mean, it's a brilliant way to bring folks into a complex argument, with, of course, the admitted downside that if people don't know the illusion, they miss the message. And I found out, I think it was my second year teaching. I was probably 25, but unless I was spending an inordinate amount of time watching current shows, listening to really bad music, eventually at the time it was Instagram. I suspect it's now TikTok. Unless I was doing that, I was just so out of touch with what the kids these days were doing. And that's only, I had to eventually make my peace with the fact that I'm just not going to be able to keep up.
Right.
And today it's, I wish I could disagree with you. I think you're spot on that does not work with Shakespeare the same way. I just read to King Lear a couple weeks ago to teach it for a continuing education class I teach for teachers in classical education were using Lear for a leadership class, and which was really fun. We had all
That's
kinds of good
interesting.
times.
Yeah.
We had lots of great discussion about authority in King Lear,
Right.
Kent as a foil and his loyalty, and
Mhm.
all these kinds of great questions, and trying to tease out what was Lear's tragic flaw, like where did it all start to
Right.
go wrong. And I kind of expected. I had 8 adults, and I think of those, 6 of them they were reading Lear for the first time past age
Wow.
40. I mean, they
Wow.
just
Yeah.
not, and these are
Yeah.
all working adults. 6 of those 8
Sure.
are involved actively in education, but
Yeah.
they just don't know Shakespeare. Like I think most of us in academia would assume people know Shakespeare, but really, people don't know
Yeah.
Shakespeare anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, I think because everyone, I don't know how it works so much in the US, but in the UK, everyone has to study Shakespeare as part of their like high school education equivalent. But that could be a long time ago, and they're not necessarily reading the whole play even. I mean, sometimes it's just kind of an excerpt here, a bit there, and so it becomes kind of muddled unless you are then going on and then you're interested and you're excited and you're watching that or seeing, whether you're seeing it on stage or you're reading the text. But yeah, I think in some ways the assumed knowledge is sort of part of the problem because we think people are going to get it, and yeah, I know people are not going to know my popular culture references because they're not popular
I,
anymore. That's okay.
I would like to put Shakespeare in a different category. I think, oh, everyone would know him.
Right.
One of the This is a tangent. We'll get back to Lewis in a moment. I'm sure, but I know one of the downsides in American education. This is both a plus, a positive, and a negative, depending on your perspective. We are so free range in our structure that we have 50 states with 50 different sets of standards and curricula, which is great if you don't like what one state is doing. And then you add in the homeschool movement, the charter school
Sure.
movement, Christian schools, the new classical school movement. All of those are variations on a theme, but it leads to this bizarre reality that you could have an incredible education that has prepared you with top-notch skills and test scores, and never have encountered someone else's most valued text in humane letters. And
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I think it's at times where I look at some of the more organized high school curricula. I've got a friend who went through the Kenyan system, and she can count on with absolute certainty everyone else in Kenya has read this book if they stayed in school. And we
Right.
just can't do that in the United States. So for better or for worse, that's our system.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There's probably benefits of that too. You get a lot more variation in terms of discussions you can have once people get beyond, once people are moving between states and so on. But yeah, it's also potentially going to be limiting as well.
Yeah. Well, let's stick with Lear a bit because that's the one I've read most recently from Shakespeare, and that I found your article in time to read it for today. Tell us a bit about Lewis's argument about affection as a kind of love, and then where Lear comes in, really as a demonstration of that particular kind of love.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so he uses Lear, as in Lear, the central King Lear from that play, as a kind of example of someone that is really desperately craving affection, but is craving it in the wrong way. Like it's in his discussion where he's thinking about what need love is in the Four Loves. So the concept of, we all need love, but we can express that need in the wrong way. And he essentially unpacks it and talks about the way that Lear demands right at the beginning of the play. He has 3 daughters, and he says essentially a question that no father should probably ever ask. Tell me, which of you loves me the most? Unfortunately, I have seen in many Shakespeare related bookshops cards which now take quotations from these and market it as Valentine's Day cards. These are not genuine expressions of love. And so the 2 eldest daughters kind of compete and they vie and they say, well, I love you this much. And then the next one wants to up that. Well, that they don't go far enough. I actually love you even more than this. So that's Goneril and Regan. And then Cordelia, his youngest daughter, whom we find out he loves the most, um, says that she is unwilling to play his game, basically. And she doesn't conform. And he takes this as a great insult because she's not performing love like he wants. And so he disowns her, essentially. Um, and one of the reasons that he's doing this, of course, at least in Shakespeare's play, the idea is that he has not really seen the genuine love, right? His daughter, his youngest daughter, very clearly loves him. We see as the play progresses, his two older daughters really don't care about him. They're interested in the land that they're going to get, and they're interested in getting rid of him and his entourage as fast as possible. And we get expressions of genuine love in the play, but for the most part, those expressions of genuine love are in the face of this like absolute ruthless love, which is just going to corrupt and destroy, which isn't real love at all. And so we see with Lear him learning the lesson eventually as the play progresses, unfortunately for him, a little too late. But he realizes that his youngest daughter really did love him. And he also realizes that he needs to care about other people rather than just himself and not be so kind of absorbed with himself, because that's part of his big problem. So Lewis essentially uses the analogy of, well, here's an expression of love. Here's love as performed. What is real love like, actually? Well, we do genuinely need the love of others, but it should not be a selfish thing whereby we simply kind of take it away. And so that's kind of why he's using it to explain what affection might look like if it is manipulated versus genuine affection and care, which maybe can't be expressed in a kind of performative fashion that is a one-upmanship, because that's not really what real love is.
That's a great explanation. I think the part of what Cordelia's line there is just so great when her father asks, "So, how will you test?" I'm going to mangle the quotation, but something to the effect of, "How will you say of me better than your sisters?" And she just says, "Nothing. I will say nothing." And one of the running distinctions in that play is the difference between reality and the appearance. And I think that's where the flattery piece comes in so clearly. The other two do a great job of seeming to love Lear, and Cordelia is making perhaps a rhetorically poor choice, but obviously the real good choice of thinking, okay, my father should remember everything I've ever done for him,
Right.
my manners, my disposition, however many years it's been. Like
Yep.
all of that should weigh in here. And Lear just chooses not to. It also it reminds me of one of my favorite moments in The Great Divorce, where of course, in that book, for any viewers or listeners who haven't read it yet, this is Lewis kind of playing with his imaginary scene of like what right just on the border of heaven, what might be purgatory moment might look like. You get there by bus. It's all kinds of fun. But I believe Lewis is the protagonist there, dreaming, if I remember correctly, or he invents a fake person who is him, but it's pretty clearly him. But he encounters this mother there who has an absolute extreme of mother love. So much so that she's walking around looking for her son, and her son is in heaven. And right. She wants her son to come back with her to hell. And it's this great picture that is, it was one of the first places I ever read anything that kind of seriously checked the right extent of parental love, that raised for me the question of, is it actually possible for parents to love their children too much? And Lewis says, yes, it is if you misunderstand love. If love is truly wanting the good of the other, then no, you can't do that too much, because that's what God does for us and he's infinite. But if love is some kind of is perverted in some selfish direction, we certainly can love too much. And we in that case, we really love ourselves and not the other.
Right. Yeah, which of course is Lear's problem as well, right? He's not actually interested necessarily in whether his daughters love him, but rather that they love only him, right? It's almost a kind of just the absolute extreme, for show, not really for actual care. And I mean, Lewis, when he's introducing the concept of Lear in the Four Loves, he basically says, well, if we lived in the same neighborhood, I could easily give you an example of this sort of person. But since we don't live in the same kind of neighborhood, then I've got to give you an example from a literary text instead.
Well, one of my favorite lines that you had, I'm gonna put that one up on the screen as well. In King Lear, we are presented with several examples of monstrous self-love in the Lear family, and you've mentioned a couple of them already. But I wonder if we go into a bit more detail on like how does this self-love become monstrous? And really, I don't know if you were intending this, but when I run into the word monstrous kind of in the wild, I always think of it in terms of the Greek sense of the monster as sort of a perversion of nature. Like the giant is not monstrous just because he's big, but because he is bigger than nature would have him be.
Sure.
That's the monstrosity. The Greek monsters would always be a combination of two natural forms, half a woman, half a snake, and it's the perversion of nature that is the monstrosity. So in that sense, what is this monstrous self love that's happening here in the Lear family?
Yeah, so I think a good example of this is the perhaps most brutal scene in Lear. Well, that depends, but a very brutal scene in Lear is when Gloucester, who is the other father in the play, and who also isn't the world's best father. I mean, he doesn't see clearly either, and unfortunately makes rather a lot of comments about blindness. Is brutally blinded. There's lines about plucking out his eyes and so on. And what we see there is essentially an attempt to completely change the way that the history is going to pan out in order to secure, well, their own position, right? I mean, that's really why they're doing it. And just the absolute grimness. I mean, when you see that on stage, it's especially horrible, as you might imagine. I saw it at the RSC in Stratford upon Avon a few years ago, and they had Gloucester in a big glass box, and then they went in and plucked out his eyes. I mean, obviously not literally; it was an actor, but there was just blood splattered everywhere, and the poor lady next to me didn't know that this was coming. She'd seen the glass box; she'd never read the play, and she turned to me afterwards because with the intermission immediately after, and she said, "Is it going to get worse?" Well, it it doesn't get better, but it's not going to be quite as bloody after this. But just that absolute breakdown of family relationships, an absolute breakdown of care about the elderly. That's a really important concept in Lear, but also care about the father's authority and what that symbolizes. And at the moment that the first eye is taken out, Gloucester's servant, I'm sorry, not Gloucester's servant, a servant steps in and says, please don't do this. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing. Lewis talks about this in The World's Last Night, and he talks about this servant figure who steps in. He doesn't even have a name, and he steps in order to try and save Gloucester. He attacks, and he's not successful. The other eye is indeed removed, but nonetheless, he tries. And Lewis essentially, when he's talking about that, says, "Well, we should all be much more like that." There aren't many figures like that in Lear, and the ones that are kind of minimized because it's a pretty brutal play. But I guess what we see is the kind of monster within the ruling characters who want to be even higher up, right? There's this kind of
Mm-hmm.
battle for authority.
Sure. Well, I think I was shocked. I'd forgotten about this. That's what happens when you read a play 5 years ago and you come back to it. Like you remember the broad sweeping strokes,
Right.
but you forget the details. I've forgotten what happens with Goneril and Regan, and I always get them confused. The one who's actually a bastard is Edmund. Or is it
Yeah.
Edgar?
So
Edmund? Like, with like, okay, hang on, I'm gonna stop there. Like, help me remember who is who of those two. I always get them mixed up.
so I'm pretty sure, and I know I'm gonna have to check this. I'm pretty sure that Edgar is the good one
Okay,
and Edmund is the bad
okay.
one. I'm pretty sure.
Well, so Goneril and Reagan, I just found it so fascinating to look at them as a progression of sin, and how kind of they start with this seemingly innocuous, very understandable picture of sin. Like they want more status, and their father is going to divide the kingdom, and like okay, that's great. Well, but there's inherently some pride, and there's some lust for power in them. But then about by Act Two, they're each going back and forth trying to get rid of their father and his entourage and any responsibility. By Act 3, they are actively beginning the civil war
Yep.
against the remnants of their father's kingdom. And by Act 5, both of them are either definitely or at least implied to be cheating on their marriages with the same bastard.
Right.
And so like and you get this progression of like their own decay as characters, and they sort of devour themselves from within. There's a great line from the Epistle of St. James where he talks about sin begins small, but it grows and ultimately it leads to death. And I think you get this picture of that
Mhm.
in those characters.
Yeah, and that they kind of become more and more their father's daughters, even as he starts to learn the lessons, right? They start to become so. I mean, I suppose it's not that surprising if you grow up in a household where people are constantly saying, "Please prove how much you love me," that you sort of have problems about that. It's kind of remarkable. Cordelia doesn't, I suppose, but we don't know if this is something that he's been doing regularly or not. Perhaps not. But we do know that he gave the largest, or he had saved the largest portion for Cordelia. And I don't imagine that her two sisters are very pleased about that. Now, obviously, Cordelia doesn't get it in the end. But yeah, they just become more and more hungry for their own gain, and willing to dispense with anyone of any significance in their lives to do that.
Wow.
It's pretty brutal.
I thought this line really kind of summed it up with what Lewis is doing. Where in Lewis's reading, King Lear dramatizes the danger of self-absorbed human love, theologically termed sin, and the corruption of persons, family, and communities to which this can lead. I love how you kind of built those concentric circles into your analysis. We got persons and family, and the broader community, because that seems to be this whole at least one level of trajectory in the play.
Yeah, because we get, I mean, the kind of poisoned state that we get in a play like Hamlet, we see that sort of building up and leading to, as you were saying, there's at the end of the play, the country's at war, right? um, and at war with communities are at war with one another, and Lear starts to sort of buck that trend, but France is brought in order to save the day. I mean, that through Cordelia, because the kingdom is just so destroyed and corrupted by that stage. Um, and we see the impact that one person's selfishness eventually then ricochets out in obviously quite extreme case here, but if you certainly the play has a potential to be read in as a kind of maybe we should behave like this. Maybe rulers should lead by example.
Wow.
And there's lots of lines about the way that fathers should behave and the way
Mm-hmm.
that that impacts upon their children, and some sort of bad examples of that early on in the play, and then fathers who do begin to learn their lesson. Um, and we also see Lear learning from the fool very clearly, and learning that he has taken too little care of the people in his kingdom, and it's a little too late, but that's also in there. So yeah, the ricocheting can work both ways, but we
Mm-hmm.
don't really see the positive it as much in King Lear, I think.
I'm so glad you mentioned the fool. I mean, I think he might be my favorite character in this
He's great.
play, and he plays. I mean, it's there's so much of Shakespeare that's just genius. I mean, he takes this very classical form of the tragedy, where without any insult meant to the lady sitting next to you at the play, if she knew it was a tragedy, she should have known the answer to the
Right,
question.
yeah.
Like, she doesn't know the exact plot device. She knows it should be only going downhill from here. But the use of that form is genius. But then taking this very traditional vision of like the one guy who was allowed to speak truth to power, and then have him actually be witty and funny, but just jaw droppingly honest in that too is
Right.
just amazing.
Yeah, he's great, and we have a kind of a parallel fool who in fact is the Edgar, who becomes poor Tom, almost seems like a fool as well, right? But he's not. He's obviously super smart and is having to hide in this disguised identity, even as he reveals these deep sort of rooted truths to his father, but then also to to the fool himself and to Lear. And yes, the fool speaks many wise words in this play, and of course the wise are in fact foolish. That's one of the ironies.
Well, Lewis is using this in, as you mentioned before, the affection love section of the Four Loves, and you built from there to make an argument about affective reading. And you did a great job, I thought, of reminding me about the rules about when I should use affective with an A and effective with an E, which I'll admit I too always struggle with. I usually have to Google I have to put the sentence in Google.
It's hard. It is hard.
Could you walk us through what is effective reading and how does that tie into what you see happening between Lewis and Shakespeare?
Sure. Yeah. So the way I think it's helpful to think about is the word emotion that we still use today implies movement, right? It implies there's motion in the word. And the E, of course, comes in front of that. But that suggests that there is a kind of movement of my feeling towards someone else or someone else's feeling towards me, right? That's inherently built into the system. So if I'm crying, for example, in my office and someone walks past, and then that might cause them to do something. They're responding to my emotion, right? But there's a kind of shared experience there. An affective reading of a text essentially looks at the way that feelings are being drawn on or are being represented, and thinks about why that might be and what it might lead other characters to do. So if we see King Lear, I'm despairing on stage, that has a direct impact on us as audience members, even if we think he might have deserved it. We're still having a kind of emotional response to that. But Shakespeare's also playing with our sympathies all the time, right? In basic terms, we've just heard that Lear is this terrible, terrible person. We shouldn't really care about him, right? But we do. We do care about him because we also, I argue at least, we see some of ourselves in that, right? Unless we think we're great, in which case we probably ought to see more of ourselves in Lear than anyone else. But affective reading is kind of thinking about the different ways that a text affects us, right? And the way that we respond to that. So Lewis uses the concept of affection a lot in the Four Loves and thinks about what that means. And we tend to think of affection meaning today just a kind of vague feeling, right? I feel affection for this person. That could be really deep, but it's, that's just kind of what it is. But Lewis really unpacks what affection looks like in both good and bad senses in the Four Loves, because it can be like you were talking about with a mother's love for her son. It can go too far, right, and then become essentially love for yourself. There's affection corrupted. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
I think so. It's a way. So effective reading, which I've got this, is a way of reading with a particular attunement to the way our affections are engaged in the reading, and that the reading is asking us to move towards some end, either towards a character that we're saying, yes, I think what you are doing is the right thing, and or perhaps also like away from a character. I think of Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment. It's like he's standing there holding the bloody axe over this like poor pawnbroker lady, and there's something in my soul that's just like, that is awful. Like, dude, I'm all about a good thought experiment. Like, that was a bad experiment. And that's part of what Lewis is after. Like, he wants to engage the affections, and he does want to move us, and he thinks that's what Lear is doing. That Lear is moving us one way or the other.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly it.
Well, I've got one last quote just to see what your thoughts are on this. I thought this summed up the affective reading part pretty effectively. We read Lewis.
Nice use of affect and effect there. Very good.
we read Lewis and are moved by Lewis's resituating of the story of Lear as a parable of affection. Part of that, perhaps, is our recognition of what the selfish loves of Lear, Goneril, and Regan might say about us, and the motion in our hearts to be different. Doubtless, Lewis hopes that his audience will respond feelingly as well to the divine love he points to throughout the Four Loves. I really like that last line in particular. It's a great reminder that really for Lewis is very cognizant of the fact that all recognition of love And this is his the high point of erotic love. I think this too is another Charles Williams note, but even there's something in the desire of Eros that ultimately should draw the soul to the divine,
Right.
and that he wants to see that kind of movement.
Yeah, I think that's right. And sometimes in the Four Loves, he's showing us it by showing what it isn't, right? Um, and sometimes he's simply pointing us in the direction of what divine love might look like. So at the end of King Lear, for instance, and he doesn't talk about this, but it's sort of almost alluded to with his reference to King Lear, we have a symbol of a kind of almost resurrection that doesn't happen. So I don't want to ruin King Lear, but it's been a play that's been out some hundreds of years, so I think I'm safe with doing this. But Lear dies not necessarily knowing whether Cordelia lives or not, right? He's pretty sure she's dead. We're pretty sure she's dead, but he seems to start to think that maybe she's alive. And there's a deeply moving moment at that point, right? The play invites us to feel very deeply at that point. But it's also pointing us towards something more, and you don't necessarily even have to be engaging with a kind of quote unquote Christian reading of the play in order to see that at work, that possibility and hope for a resurrection that doesn't come points to a kind of desire of love for that which does come, right? So there's this, and Lewis kind of unpacks those sorts of things, not just in Shakespeare, of course, but all over the place.
Well, it's the kind of movement that Tolkien would have called catastrophic. I can see the word as eucatastrophe, and there we go.
Yeah.
There we go. We needed a British voice for that British neologism. But there's that sense of, and that too is so part of the tragic form. I think that's the last time I had the chance to teach Sophocles, I was so struck by the fact his gift of taking us right to the edge of perceiving the depths and the horror of just how evil and small-minded we are, and yet how good we want to be and how grand we imagine ourselves to be. And the gap between those two things is no thing that a mere human can cross. And that's, I think, Shakespeare is reaching for the same kind of insight and it just leaves us as the audience thinking, oh man, how much more do we need? There's just something here that can't be quite satisfied. And Lewis, of course, would say that every desire in fact, every true desire is a desire for something that can satisfy it. So that the very existence of that desire should point us to something larger and grander and more than we are.
Right, absolutely. The fact that Lear desires love is not a bad thing. He asks for it in the wrong way, and he asks the wrong people for it in the wrong fashion, perhaps. But his desire to be loved is a desire that is inherently human, right? And that's because we are made to love. But as Lewis gets into in a whole lot more detail, but one of the, we are made to love God, right? So there's that is something that is a missing connection in Lear. And we have different models of what that love can look like in human affection. That model can look like loving your daughters and your daughters loving you. But that can also be completely destroyed because we're humans and we destroy stuff. So, yeah.
I think it was G.K. Chesterton who once coined the line that the doctrine of sin is the only doctrine that can be verified purely from history without any need of systematic theology. That's, right. I think he's absolutely right about that. Well, Sarah, as we begin to wrap up our conversation today, I want to ask I've got two questions left. First off, hopefully this is obvious from our conversation, but I love drawing things hopefully to a point. Why should lovers of Shakespeare read Lewis, and why should lovers of Lewis read Shakespeare?
Great. So I think lovers of Lewis should read Shakespeare, partly because they should just read Shakespeare, or at least see Shakespeare, because I think Shakespeare's great. But also because when Lewis is using these kind of analogies, you just get so much more out of the text by having a frame of reference. So even if with Lear, for instance, you just read a kind of basic plot summary, that will really help you enormously to get the kind of point that Lewis is making. It's a bit like when he makes some kind of circumnavigate point from some obscure philosophical concept. If you don't know the concept, you'll get something out of it, but you won't necessarily get the depth. And because Lewis has so many frames of reference, you can just get layers upon layers out of it by having that sort of wider reading. And I think people that already know Shakespeare but don't know Lewis, or know less of Lewis perhaps, also because of the way that he thinks about Shakespeare's plays particularly, but Shakespeare more broadly perhaps as well, and thinks about the way that we see the human in the plays. That's something that he's directly responding to what other critics have done by ripping it apart and thinking about character criticism, which was a kind of big thing in his period. And so he's more interested in Shakespeare's depiction of the everyman kind of figure. And that's something that it's really easy to lose sight of when you just get into the depths of criticism. And Lewis kind of pulls us back and says, hey, look at the story that's actually being told here. Think about the fact that we have a story about this really selfish man and what he learns, for instance. And so he has a way of kind of helping us almost re-see a text that you might already be really familiar with.
I love that last point. I think there's a part pretty early on in an experiment on criticism where Lewis talks about an undergraduate who is trying to read Plato. And the undergraduate's first instinct is to go to the stacks at the library and pull out all the academic views on Plato. And Lewis is like, no, don't do that. Just go read Plato. He actually is very comprehensible. I think for some reason, there is still, I don't know if you see this as much in the UK, but certainly in the US, I feel very happy to generalize on this point. Americans feel so intimidated by Shakespeare. And there is this aura of the bard and archaic language. And I honestly, I think it's kind of silly because I have read Shakespeare with sixth graders, 10-year-olds, and I've read Shakespeare with adults. And everybody has the same initial barriers. If they can just push past a little bit of a different vibe and lingo, they can get Petruchio without needing to like look up every word. And they will get the dirty jokes and they will get some pretty profound truths while they're accidentally laughing at stuff that they would never say at the water cooler. And all of that's there, but it's there in Shakespeare himself. Shakespeare critics, with no offense to present company, if you happen to also be one of these, but the Shakespeare critics can be some of the most unfunny and driest people on the planet. Shakespeare is so much more interesting, I think, than reading Shakespeare criticism. And Lewis points us back to that reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I remember sort of having this problem myself as an undergraduate, at least. And I remember distinctly one of my tutors saying, you've got to stop reading as much secondary criticism. You're forgetting what you think, and you're forgetting how important what you think is. And I would just have this habit. I would go to the library and read everything on the reading list that there was secondary material. And I'd read the primary source, but it was so far back in my radar by that stage that I couldn't unpick what I thought versus what everyone else thought, right? And it can be really kind of stifling. That can be really unhelpful. And Lewis is really good at saying, no, let's go back to the primary sources and then sure, engage with what other people are saying. But your response is really important to the text. And also Shakespeare is writing plays to entertain. That's really important. It's easy to lose sight of that.
No, it's so true. And Lewis himself, for all of his love of primary sources, he was no slouch when it came to the secondary literature. Right. I mentioned that the Fairy Queen project a bit earlier. There are several of those footnotes that are him just like he's just quoting lines that he remembers from other Spencer scholars, and he's interacting with them in his own annotations as he's working through the text. And so he's encountering the primary with the secondary in view. And I wonder if in his essay on the reading of old books, he gives that great formula: one old book for every new book. And I wonder if he followed something like that in his own reading or some variation thereof.
Yeah, maybe so. And I mean, what you're describing with Spencer, he does absolutely with Shakespeare as well. And when I was looking, I've looked a little at the material in UNC as well, and he does the same with other writers. You know, this is sort of habitual. So I suspect so. He does it with John Donne. I mean, he is sort of all over the show. And what's bizarre is that some critics have a habit of saying, well, Lewis didn't really know much about secondary sources. He just kind of wrote about the text. Hang on a second, but let's backtrack. Actually, he is trying to make his lecture material, his criticism accessible. And so it's less heavy on the footnotes, but also that was more the case then anyway. And that doesn't necessarily equate to didn't know anything about the topic area. He does value primary over secondary. I think that certainly is true. And we've sort of got the balance the other way around in an unhelpful way today, I think.
Well, with all of those words about the proper balance between primary and secondary, I know you're working on your own book that is probably trying to straddle that same space. So tell us a little bit about your book project, and is there a timeline on when we can go order your book?
Sure. So I'm working on having slammed secondary critics. I'm doing that. I'm working on a book on Lewis and Shakespeare. So that's going to look, or it is looking at the different ways that he engaged with Shakespeare across his career. So some of that will be him using Shakespeare in his apologetics, like we were talking about with Lear and the Four Loves, Hamlet, when he's using that in Pilgrim's Regress and Surprised by Joy, for example. But also looking at the kind of primary work he was doing in his own teaching, in his own publishing on Shakespeare, his unpublished material on Shakespeare, looking at his annotations, and what that looks like, and how he uses Shakespeare in his fiction as well. So that includes, but is not limited to, Narnia. So it's sort of a kind of comprehensive look at what's Shakespeare doing, what's Lewis doing engaging with Shakespeare, and why aren't we talking about it? In terms of timeline, that I defer to my publisher, but I'm hoping that it's going to be sooner rather than later. We're excited about it. The publisher is excited about it. That's with Kent State University Press, and they've recently acquired a particular line of study that's looking at medieval and Renaissance texts, and the idea is that it's going to be part of that stream. Although, of course, they also have an Inklings specialist line as well. So hopefully, it'll fit nicely within that sort of scope.
Well, that's exciting. Well, I will do my best to keep an eye out, and please do let me know as you get closer to publication. And we'll have to get you back on the show to talk about the finished product by the time it's there. Well, Sarah, how can people find and follow your work online if they want to know more about what you're doing?
Sure. So I'm on the artist formerly known as Twitter. You can find me on X if you like. I'm at SRA Waters. You can also find my institutional page. If you simply Google my name and Buckingham, it will come up. And I have a academia.edu, I believe, still functioning. But in terms of publications, they're more lodged on journal sites for the most part, unless it's open access, in which case that's easy to find, and anything that isn't goes onto our repository, which is called BEAR, which is great. It stands for Buckingham Electronic Archives and Research. But that means that anything that's behind a paywall, you can access that way. So I've got stuff up there as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a great conversation. It's always fun to meet somebody that I can talk about a favorite play with. That was delightful.
Oh, thank you for having me.
You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please do find and follow us on X and on YouTube. On X, you can find me as @TheOptimisticC3, and on YouTube, just search for Optimistic Curmudgeon. We want to make sure that you have the ability to find and follow all of our content. And then if you're looking at the show description, you'll see links to any resources that were referenced in the show, as well as the sponsors for this episode. Please do check those out. We are very grateful for a variety of different institutions in helping to make this show possible. Until next time, seek the good, enjoy the true, and live the beautiful.